Well, welcome to the Ohio Fair Lending's Forum on the State of Ohio. And the state of the state, or as it's known as the state of the budget, actually, is what we're going to be talking about today. And the way you do politics in Ohio is you carve out a budget for a 2-year period, and it's a 3-act play. It starts with the governor's office, and it goes to the House, it goes to the Senate, it goes back to the Senate, the House, all together, and they make a deal, and you have a budget. In Ohio, because we really don't have much participation from one party and all the participation from the other party, the budget is crafted by, in this case, the Republican Party. In years past, it was the Democratic Party. It's been quite a while since those days. But today we have a kind of a lineup of people who spent a lot of time in the Capitol Square working on different line items, working on social justice issues in Columbus, which is a difficult job. And I'll turn it over to John Corlett. John and I served together on the Cuyahoga County Mental Health Board. And let me tell you what a trip that was. But, you know, you make progress and you make friends there and you make social justice. And I want to welcome John, who's going to talk and introduce our speakers. And we want to be able to take questions from everybody and put them in the chat, and we'll get them to the right speakers or to the entire panel. So take it over, John.
Thanks, Chip, and thanks for having me today. My name is John Corlett. I'm the president of the Center for Community Solutions, and have been sort of following state budgets for a little bit of time now. You know, the one observation I'd make about this budget, I don't think it's the budget we expected a few months ago. I think, you know, when this pandemic started that we're experiencing now, I think we felt that this was going to be a very difficult budget, that state revenues were likely to be greatly diminished, and that would create some big challenges in the budget. That has not come to pass. State revenues are actually doing fairly well. I mean, they're certainly not robust, but they're not in the sort of negative territory that we might have expected, you know, at the beginning of this process. And the state has also been the beneficiary of a lot of additional federal aid, starting as early as last year, you know, enhanced Medicaid funding and things like that, that has helped, you know, the state work its way through the pandemic and has made this budget probably an easier budget than we might have expected. You know, the only other thing I would say about, you know, Chip said this was a 4-act play. I think it's a 5-act play because the last and final act is the governor when he signs and then decides what to veto in the budget.
Oh.
And I have been involved with more budgets where that 5th act is sometimes a surprise. That's something you got through the legislature, then gets vetoed, line item vetoed by the governor. And as somebody, when I was Medicaid director, who wrote veto messages, you know, it's often a last minute, those are last minute decisions. So I think this is well timed. We're coming at a really critical moment in the budget process. I think most of us are waiting to see what the Senate is going to do with the budget that the House sent to them. You know, the House obviously made a number of changes from the governor's as introduced version. The Senate is likely to make changes as well. And then we will come down to conference committee and resolve those differences and get a budget hopefully to the governor on time so that we can wrap this process up the end of June. So I'm going to start by first introducing our panelists. We've got a really good group, I think, people with some diverse background and experience that will kind of give us a broader view of the budget that we might otherwise have. They've got some presentations. I've got some questions. I know if you've got questions, you can type those in the chat. Catherine will be keeping track of those, and then we'll sort of come back to those towards the end of this process. So let me start with the introductions. And some of this I'm going to have to look at my notes, so I apologize for that. But the person I want to introduce first is Bill Faith, who probably doesn't really need a lot of introduction. He has served as Ohio's executive director for 27 years. He's probably worked on more budgets than any of us. You know, in my mind, he also has the claim to fame of helping establish the Housing Trust Fund, as well as a dedicated revenue source for it. And that's a singular accomplishment that doesn't happen very often in budget process. But throughout his career, Bill's worked to develop housing solutions for people with disabilities. He's directed agencies serving the needs of homeless and promoted affordable housing. On the national level, Bill has served as the chairman of the National Low Income Housing Coalition for 6 years, and he was also president of the board of directors for the National Coalition for the Homeless. So he's got local experience, state experience, and national experience. So he's well positioned to comment on some of these issues. The next person I want to introduce is Brian Mallory. And I think it's interesting. He told us he comes to this movement because of his family. His mother was an AME pastor who was dedicated to social justice issues, particularly those affecting children. Brian was a part of his mother's ministry as a young man, and gravitated towards those issues related to homelessness. He became homeless himself as a young adult, and he began his own personal journey, first as a volunteer helping out in shelters and food distribution for the unhoused, and then as a worker for various social service agencies in the community. He currently serves as the community organizer for Organize Ohio Noble, and he works collaboratively with Utilities for All Group and End Poverty Now Coalition. And he's also part of something which I think is really interesting, the Ohio Poor People's Campaign, which is a national organization, but he is involved as the tri-chair of the state Ohio Poor People's Campaign. So we're happy to have Brian with us. Jason Warner is the Director of Strategic Engagement for the Greater Ohio Policy Center. He's responsible for representing them at the Ohio Statehouse, advocating for the issues and policy positions central to that organization's mission. And the other thing that's great about Jason, I think, for this conversation, is that he has extensive experience working in the legislature. So he it's an animal of itself. And, understanding that process, understanding how legislators view things, and particularly a budget. A budget is, particularly for new legislators, they kind of come in, they get elected, they take office in January, and they start in that budget year. I mean, for most of them, I think it's a rude awakening because it's such an intense process and moves seemingly quickly, although sometimes very slowly. But he worked with the House Ways and Means Committee, the House Finance Transportation Subcommittee, and he was also involved in the committee that when I was state Medicaid director that I spent an inordinate amount of time with, and that is the Joint Committee on Agency Rule Review, JCAR as it's fondly known. And that's actually, we should have a presentation sometime just on that, because if you want to interfere with an agency or stop them from doing something, JCAR is the place to do it, because there's very few legislators involved and they have tremendous power that I don't think a lot of people realize. But for the last 8 years, Jason's worked as a policy advocate, working on issues including education, housing, transportation, community revitalization, and brownfield development. Last but not least is Amanda Woodrum. She's a senior researcher focusing on issues found at the intersection of health, equity, and the economy. She said that after she lived in New York City and experienced 9/11, that she wanted to return to Ohio, and she was determined to make Ohio the kind of place she wanted to live. So we're going to check in with you on that, Amanda. But she's joined Policy Matters in 2007 after receiving a master's degree in economics and a law degree from the University of Akron. She conducts really extensive research on the role transportation, energy, health, and anti-poverty policy can play to promote a more sustainable and equitable economy and future in Ohio. So we're going to start with Bill Faith. And, Bill, you've worked, as I said, on more state budgets than any of us. So I know you'll probably talk about some of these things, but the things I'm interested in, I don't think before I started, I realized how important the state budget was in terms of policy. I used to always think, well, it's just numbers, it's just spending. And that was sort of my uninitiated view before I got into this work. But tell us a little bit about why it's important, what's important to Ohio. I know there's some particular programs you're interested in that I know you're going to get into. And then the other question is sort of what's the impact of ARPA, the American Rescue Plan Act, on all of this? We know that there's a lot of resources coming to the state and local governments. So if you can comment on that, that would be great too.
Great. Well, thanks, John. I have a, let's see, I have a PowerPoint that Catherine is in control of, I believe. But yeah, there it is. So we could get off of that slide. Everybody knows my name now. I'm going to keep in mind what you talked about, John, because I do think the state budget for the Ohio legislature is the single biggest, most important bill every 2 years. There's nothing that compares to it. Every once in a while, there are other big important bills, but you could count on it every biennium that the budget's going to be the place where everybody tries to cram everything in because it's a must-pass bill. So they're on a deadline. They have to have it passed and enacted normally by July 1st, although that doesn't always happen. So it's a great place to add amendments, particularly if you could kind of grease them through the process, because you could get something done quickly and easily and maybe fly under the radar. But it's the single biggest, most important bill. It's counted in the thousands of pages. It has a lot more than spreadsheets. The spreadsheets are what everybody focuses on, but there's a lot of very important, as we call it, language in the bill, which is basically state policy. But I wanted to start by just putting all this stuff in context. We did have a time pre-COVID, people may recall, and you know, housing issues were a big deal, big problem then, and it still is. You know, mostly because people don't make enough money to pay the rent. At three of the most 10 common jobs don't pay enough to afford a basic 2-bedroom apartment. We had 400,000 people that were on the edge of being housing insecure. They were paying more than 50% of their income on rent, which means they were at risk at any point in time. And we had 100,000 or more evictions every year. So those, and people, unlike Medicaid and SNAPs and other programs, if you're eligible for housing assistance, it doesn't mean a great deal because only 1 in 4 people that are eligible for a voucher, a rental assistance voucher, can receive it. So the next slide shows that those were our problems, and COVID made them worse. So, you know, we had a lot of people that lost jobs, and even still, particularly for low-wage workers, if you just look at January numbers this year compared to January numbers of 2020, we're still at a loss. I mean, it's getting better. I have to say, there are more people going back to work and more job openings out there, but the jobs don't pay living wages, and people are reluctant to take them. So there's a lot of employers that are complaining that people don't want to work, and I would say employers don't want to pay, and that's why people don't want to go work for them. We need to increase wages going forward to help people make a more livable wage. The rent problem is the biggest problem because the impact of COVID hit low-wage workers. So low-wage workers tend to rent, not own. And so rental is the big problem. Current numbers put us at around 18% of Ohio tenants are behind in their rent. There's a lot of different estimates on this, and they're all bad. So this is one indicator we got from the Census Bureau, but there's other indicators out there. Ohio's ranked around 9th of the highest portion of renters at risk of eviction. The next slide starts to look at what the federal government did about this. And I was spending so much time with the federal folks, both with the advocacy groups that were pushing on things and with our members of the Ohio delegation, several of whom are very critical to the process. Sherrod Brown being very much an important figure in all of this, and has been great in pushing for housing solutions along with a lot of other things. But just to take you back over the last year or so, you know, we had the CARES Act that was $2.2 trillion, you know, a small little bill that made its way through Congress back in March of last year. And it had, you know, the $1,200 stimulus checks, the $600 a week unemployment compensation bump, you know, the payroll protection program loans, all kinds of stuff. And then they had this slush fund, or whatever you want to call it, this flexible pot of money that was given to states and local governments that was called the Coronavirus Relief Fund. That was a particular fund that there was a great amount of flexibility on what the state and local governments could do with that. In Ohio, that played out between the legislature and the governor. The governor probably drove the process more on spending the state share. So you had to get on the governor's radar if you wanted to get a piece of that action. But we also were able to get some things done by working with some of the legislative leaders who then bugged the governor's people about adding some things into their plan. Then came in December, the Consolidated Appropriations Act, which was another $900 billion that passed right around Christmas. And again, it talked about stimulus checks, $300 a week unemployment bump, more payroll protection loans, the Coronavirus Relief Fund extension, meaning they gave the state and local governments more time to spend the money they got. And this is when we first saw a big hunk of rental assistance money, specific language, specific program they call the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, or as we call ERA. In Ohio, at the state level, they call it the Home Relief Program, Home Relief Grant Program, but it's all the same thing. So there's, and then it had all the normal COVID stuff, vaccines and testing. And then the next slide shows another bill that John mentioned called the American Rescue Plan. And this is a pie chart. Chip asked me to find a pie chart. So this is a pie chart which shows all the different places that the American Rescue Plan put money. And I've learned a long time ago, when you're trying to be an advocate, you need to know how to follow the money. That's the game. So you look at where the money is and where it goes, and that's how you might be able to siphon off some for projects you're working on. This bill was big, $1.9 trillion. So that passed in March of 21, more stimulus checks, more unemployment supplement for unemployment benefits, $300 a week, the child tax credit, which is very exciting, and health insurance, school funding, et cetera, et cetera. You could see where the different piles of money are. What I'm going to talk about is this little orange sliver, which is the housing money that was part of the American Rescue Plan. That little sliver represents $40 billion. Okay, so that's what we're drilled down on. That's where Ohio's spending a lot of time following that money and making sure we get that implemented well. The next slide shows that with the CARES Act and the Consolidated Appropriations Bill, we were able to get some money targeted to emergency rent, mortgage, utility assistance. In fact, it was $111 million that we got through the governor taking steps finally in around October to allocate some of the money from coronavirus relief funds to these things. He did $55 million, and then Development Services Agency did another $56 million for the same activities, but they used a different source, which was extra money they got for CDBG. So it was the state share of CDBG. So total, we had $111 million that was put out in the fall of 2020, utilizing the community action agencies and so forth to distribute the funds. Some cases they subcontracted with other groups, like they're doing in Cleveland with CHN Housing Partners, which is doing a good job trying to administer this massive pile of money. So Cleveland got a direct allocation from ERA out of that first patch of ERA. I think Cleveland got a little over $11 million directly, and then Cuyahoga County got $25.5 million directly from the Emergency Rental Assistance Program. The state got $564 million. So we're working on getting that steered out to the people that need it. And then, you know, a total of 18 local governments received their own allocation. Let's see, I'll probably go to the next slide here. Oh, I do have to say before I leave our senators that the Consolidated Appropriations Act that passed in December, I would have to give credit to both of our senators, because Sherrod Brown introduced a big bill on rental assistance that got big numbers being talked about early on in the process. So he provided early leadership. But when we were making that deal in December, we were working closely with Portman and his staff over weekends and really trying to do rapid education and discussion about how this could be structured, so that that $25 billion that made its way into the Consolidated Appropriations Act, Senator Portman deserves some credit for helping us get that done. So then the next slide, let's see, yeah, Uncle Joe, the one with, if we go back to President Biden, yeah. So this is the American Rescue Plan. This is the money that we're watching. This was the bill that was passed just in March. And so we're still getting used to this. It provided an additional $21.5 billion of the ERA money. We think $614 million of that will make its way to Ohio eventually, although the formal allocations from Treasury have not been specified. There's some other cool things in that bill related to housing. For the first time, we have $5 billion allocated to for what they call emergency housing vouchers. The idea is that maybe if we gave homeless people a voucher, they wouldn't be homeless anymore. It's a great concept that we hope takes hold and expands to a more reasonable level. They chose 15 public housing authorities in Ohio to receive an allocation. A total number of vouchers is only going to be 1,522 for those 15 PHAs. Cuyahoga MHA, CMHA up there was allocated 339. So that's the biggest in Ohio. So it's not earth shaking, but it is good progress. There's this other program that people call Home. It has a number of names, but I'm trying to call it Home ARP because it's not the regular home program. This has a whole different set of eligible activities, a whole different focus than the normal home program. And it's specifically targeted to homeless people. So this is for, really, there's a range of eligible activities, but I think the reading from talking to people at HUD and the new team, senior management people, they're going to emphasize this money should go to housing development or housing availability. So it could be used for tenant-based vouchers. It could be used for building new housing opportunities, from supportive housing to other kinds of housing, targeting people that are homeless and people that are at risk. So that will be a good boost to the effort. A little over 200 million for the state, 90 million of which will be distributed by the state, and the balance goes out to, I believe it's 18 local jurisdictions. So Cleveland and Cuyahoga County will no doubt get their own, well, I know they're getting their own allocation. There's also money for foreclosure prevention. I know some of you on the line here were involved in other big foreclosure prevention efforts in the past. So this will be revisiting that effort. There's 281 million coming to Ohio. My understanding, it's not formalized yet, but it's going to OFA. OFA, the Ohio Housing Finance Agency, will be administering that. And hopefully they'll partner with local groups. I particularly want to see them pay local outreach efforts to make sure we're reaching to underserved communities and communities that are often neglected. And then they'll have probably a portal where people would apply online. That's all still in process, but they do have 281 million to distribute, so that should help some of our struggling homeowners. There is a little bit of extra money for energy assistance. Most of it goes out through HEAP. The regular HEAP program will be a supplemental funding for that. And there's a new program, which I kind of am interested in, for home water assistance. So people to keep the water on. During the pandemic, we had a number of people around the state that were getting shut off. Kind of hard to wash your hands when, you know, they're shutting your water off. So I think there's a new emphasis. Generally, HEAP covers gas and electric, but this will be interesting to see this new, it's smaller, but it's a new effort to get that funded. The one I really want to, the next slide shows, I actually don't know what building that is, but
City Hall.
What is it?
City Hall in Cleveland.
Oh, there you go. Sorry, I'm like, that's not my normal romping grounds, but that's Marcus. Marcus stuck these pictures on these slides. But anyway, this American Rescue Plan has that big chunk that was on the pie chart. I think maybe the second biggest was for the state and local budget relief. And as John said, we thought our budgets were going to be in much worse shape over the last year or so as the pandemic caused so much unemployment. So they built this big fund, $350 billion. 5.6 will go to the state of Ohio, 2.3 will go to various counties, including Cuyahoga at 250 million, 2.2 to the cities, and then they also break, it's 512, I think, and not quite as much as some people thought it would be up in Cleveland, but still 512 is pretty big amount. And the next slide talks about what are the principles to guide the use of these funds, which this is fairly recent information that came out from Treasury. These are the things they want that money to be used for. Now, if you read between the lines, I'm not going to read these. Hopefully you guys could see the, oh, wait a minute, you got to go to the next slide. There they are. So hopefully you all could see these. You know, it's really almost anything, you know, it's not quite everything. You know, there could be, if I were to write this list, I would have written it a little differently. But, you know, they're trying to make sure that it's talking about restoring funding quite a bit, like for schools, education. I like this one, boosting incomes for essential workers. It'll be great to see how much that happens. I mean, are we going to really give people a raise, which would be nice to see. But anyway, you can see public safety, enhancing broadband, etc. So this is that the local governments, the state governments going to have a process to distribute these funds. We're still trying to figure out what that process is going to be at the state level. We know they're using some of the money to shore up the unemployment system, but what else they're going to use it for, God knows. I mean, maybe even God doesn't know yet. So we'll see. We'll see what they do, but it's an opportunity to advocate and lobby for stuff that needs to be happening or should be happening with this money. So keep this in mind. I know that we could share the PowerPoint with everybody. We're getting this stuff as any way we can. So the next slide's talking about what's going to happen next is an infrastructure bill. At least that's what President Biden hopes will happen next. The infrastructure bill, we've been lobbying around this with our delegation. He said, let's put $213 billion into housing as infrastructure. We like that. The things they're talking about are public housing, increase in National Housing Trust Fund. We'd like to see an emphasis on housing choice vouchers. There's a link on here to NLHC, National Low Income Housing Coalition, which is doing a great job lobbying around all this. The next slide, I'll just mention a few things about the state budget, because I want you to understand that all this federal money that's been coming and is continuing to come and will continue to come is kind of pales what the state is doing otherwise. And so we've been focused around the federal stuff. There are some things we want to do in the state budget. You can see the lineup of some of the key leaders that are involved in the process. There's the governor, and then Cupp is the House Speaker, and Huffman is the President of the Senate. Olslager is the House Finance Chair. Dolan, you all know, is the Senate Finance Chair. And the two people on the ends, guess what party they're from? The other ones are all Republicans. Vernon Seitz, who's a veteran of the legislature, is the lead guy for the Democrats of the Senate. And Rep. Crawley, Erica Crawley, is a great person. She's from Columbus and has been writing herd on the budget for the Dems in the House. So there's a bunch of stuff that some of the things we're seeing are tax cut proposals, which just seem really stupid to me, but it didn't stop the House from putting in a big, it's not that big compared to some of the past tax cuts, but still a tax cut, like maybe some new investments in some of the programs we need might have been a better idea. But school funding is a big theme. They're talking a lot about business assistance, kind of their favorite stuff. There's other stuff. The Housing Trust Fund, we're up to about $55 million a year. We did hit our $1 billion mark this past year in terms of spending from the Housing Trust Fund. That was kind of a benchmark. But we're also working on some little programs. We have a youth homelessness program we're advocating for, and it's been more work than it should be. But we're looking like we're going to get at least $5 million, and we have 2 or 3 members of the Senate that are offering amendments to increase that. The other one we're working on is Healthy Beginnings at Home, which is a project to help pregnant women avoid infant mortality, and it's really about giving pregnant women opportunities to get assisted housing, like rental assistance, so that they could have a safe, affordable place to live while they're pregnant and during the first year of the baby's life. I think I'm going a little long, but we did get the permanent supportive housing property tax issue fixed for any of those who were following that. We're fighting off, along with a lot of other advocates, this Senate Bill 17, which would just put more bureaucratic barriers in people's way to access benefits, kind of a kick them while they're down proposal, which is gathering steam and may well pass or be included in the budget. The next slide is a little more information on the Healthy Beginnings at Home. We're hoping to expand to more cities we're really at a research stage with this program. So they tried it in Columbus with good results. You can see on the slide. And then the money to expand it would help it to go to more cities. And hopefully one of those could be Cleveland, to do housing assistance as part of the services we offer to pregnant women to avoid these problems. The other thing I want to mention, and I'll finish, is the last slide, which is tenant protection issues. So there's a variety of activity on this front. Local governments are passing source of income discrimination legislations, or right to counsel like they did in Cleveland, or pay to stay legislation, which we've seen in many communities. There's some of that activity at the Statehouse. The one that has bipartisan support is an eviction record expungement bill, which we'll see. Senator Coonsey, a Republican, and Senator Craig, a Democrat, are pushing that. So we're trying to encourage the locals to move on these issues. We had a forum for advocates, webinar, I think it was last week, and we're looking to do more. So if you're interested in those topics, send me an email and we'll make sure you're informed when we're doing another forum. Well, I'll stop there. I know I went too long, but I was trying to cover a lot of ground.
Thanks, Bill. We did give you a lot to talk about, so I appreciate that. The one comment I'd make about that Healthy Beginnings program that you talked about, when I worked at Metro Health, one of the things that was sort of surprising to me was mothers who had babies in our NICU and our intensive care unit. One of the things we learned was, on average, they had moved anywhere from 2 to 3 times during their 9 months of pregnancy. And so, it's clear that that housing instability, has a negative impact, on those moms and their babies and stuff. And so I think that's a really important initiative that you're pushing there. So
yeah, I think we've known that it makes sense. I think the issue is we don't really have the science to prove that it works. And when you're dealing with the healthcare field, it's good to have some science, I've learned. And so the pilot in Columbus had good results, which are on that slide, but we want to replicate it elsewhere. We've gotten some interest at the national level on this because it just hasn't been tried at very many places in the country before. So we actually may be doing something that other places can learn from us on this. So we're hoping that gets funded. There's a lot of support for it. So I think we're going to get this money nailed down.
That's great. Thanks, Bill. Well, I'm going to turn to Brian Mallory. And Brian, you've talked about seeing the state budget as a moral document. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what you mean by that, and talk about some of the issues that you're following, what's important to Organize Ohio, Noble, and to the Ohio Poor People's Campaign. So I'll turn it over to you, Brian.
Thank you, John. Can you hear me? Am I coming through okay?
Yeah.
All right, fantastic. I don't have a whole lot of slides, but I just want to put it in the context of how we on the Poor People's Campaign look at this. First of all, I just want to thank you for being here because, yes, we are a statewide movement. We're not actually an organization. And we coordinate with 45 other states in the District of Columbia, putting forth what we wanted to see as the beloved community. This began with Dr. King back in 67, 68. And at that time, he identified what he called what we call 5 systemic interlocking evils. And just briefly, that's systemic racism, systemic poverty, ecological devastation, militarism, the war economy, and the false moral narrative of religious nationalism. And these 5 interlocking things are reflected in our budgets. We feel a budget is a moral document that highlights what is important to the society. And we, the people, in our founding documents, the government is supposed to be we, the people, us, and its focus should be on all the people, not just those who have access and those who are at the top. So because of that, we are calling not only at the national level, but at the state level and the local level for people to get involved in this process, because the budget is important. So having said that, if we could go to the next slide, please. We are endeavoring across the state to be this new unsettling force. We are going to mobilize, organize, register folks around these issues, and engage in the process. And that's particularly important for us here in Ohio. There's some myths out there about poor and our country's ability to address these issues. We live in the richest country in the world. We have abundant resources to protect the environment, to ensure dignified lives for all of our people. The problem has really been a matter of priorities. And we have seen, because of this COVID-19 pandemic, all the disparities, all the inequity has been starkly exposed. We've seen this past year the inequities and the differences among various groups in our country evolve in civil disruptions and people hitting the streets and making their voices heard. So that's where we are. We know that for a state like Ohio, for example, the richest 100% of Ohio residents are expected to receive 25% of the benefits, of the federal tax laws. This is like the tax cut that just happened in 2017, overwhelmingly went to the top, while the poorest 20% are expected, to live with the crumbs that come from that. Ohio's contribution to, the war economy in the wars of Iraq and Afghanistan, that's well beyond $165 billion since 2001. Can you imagine how many jobs that could have been created in Ohio? That's over 131,000. Areas in like clean energy. How many children could we have placed in Head Start or early childhood development programs? How many of our people who need medical care could have been covered with Medicaid? That's 2.1 million adults, with money like that. So we are just out there trying to advocate down in Columbus on some very specific things. I want to thank Bill in the area of housing. Is very, very inclusive in that. I just want to touch on a couple of areas in housing. We are concerned about our unhoused folks, and there's some specific things in the budget that we would like to see around those issues. We would like to see more equitable tax treatment. Right now, the ARP, the American Rescue Plan, is going to increase the earned income tax credit. Here in the state of Ohio, 30% of that is unrefundable, not refundable. So if you're on the lower income, that first 30%, is not refundable. We would like to see a 10% refundable option in addition to that. And the choice, either 10% refundable or 30% non-refundable, whatever amount is higher, and that is going to lift a lot of people out of poverty. It's going to put, folks at the lower end of the income scale, money in their pocket. The state needs additional revenue generation, for the purposes of investing in workforces, families, community services, maintaining crucial state services, and there's some very specific things we'd like to see. This 3% special tax.
I don't know.
Paul,
I go with his advice.
I'm sorry.
Yes,
Yes,
see you later. Thanks.
We'd like to see that eliminated. There should be no reduction in income tax rates we want to reinstate the 7.5% tax rates for incomes over $220,000 annually. You want those loopholes, that so-called corporate tax loophole, we would like that eliminated as well. The state should increase its severance tax on oil and gas companies so it's comparable to other producing states. We're woefully behind on that. And, we also oppose any attempt to end the municipal income tax withholding by the original City of Employment as approved in the 2020 House Bill 197. If the General Assembly should approve legislation or a lawsuit should require this change, the state should make good on city revenue losses. Now, I mean, that sounds really wonky, John, but for folks that are at the lower end of the income levels, that's an important thing if you're living in one town and working in another and getting taxed like that. So we of course are very much concerned about the areas of healthcare. In particular, we in Ohio have a great disparity between foster care, adoption care, and what is called kinship care. We want to see more money in the area of helping out poor families, single parent families, daycare and childcare increased. But let me just stop there, John. I mean, there's a lot of things that we know we can do better on here in the state. Before I pass it on, I do want to highlight that beginning May 24th, we do what we call Moral Mondays, and our May 24th, we are delivering a demand around poverty, around our poverty demands. That will be culminating in our activities across the United States to push the House, the U.S. House, contact all of our representatives here in Ohio, and to get them to support these poverty demand initiatives. That we hope will culminate in a major action across our country in June 7th, where we hope that this legislation will be introduced to the U.S. House. We here in Ohio are pressing to get our state General Assembly to follow along suit and to implement those demands that we will be rolling out Monday the 24th. So that just very briefly is a little bit about what's going on over here, the Poor People's Campaign here in Ohio, and a little bit about the work that I'm doing around Noble and everything. Thank you for the time.
Thanks, Brian. And you don't have to apologize about wonkiness. I have a suspicion that this is a wonky crowd, and love to live in the policy weeds. So no apologies needed for wonkiness. So next up is Jason Warner from the Greater Ohio Policy Center. I want to comment, Jason. I thought your group put out some really excellent recommendations for the state and for the city and for cities to think about how they approach these new funds that are available under the American Rescue Plan. But I know you follow maybe some other issues in the state budget that not all of us follow. Things around transportation, around greenfields and things like that, or brownfields, I should say. But anyways, so I wonder if you might give us your views about the budget and how you think things are going.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for that, John. And yeah, I wish that I could claim authorship and credit for those 11 principles on the ARPA funds. That is definitely outside of my wheelhouse. All credit goes to the rest of the staff here for that. But thank you very much. I do appreciate that, and want to thank everyone who's been able to join us here today. I think that this is a very important dialogue that we're having about the state budget. And appreciate the opportunity to share a little bit about what Greater Ohio has been involved in. I do have a slideshow. I'm not sure if we have that available to put that up or not. There we go. All right, so we can just go ahead and skip to the next slide about Greater Ohio Policy Center. We are a statewide not-for-profit organization with the mission to improve the communities of Ohio through smart growth strategies and research, with a vision for a revitalized Ohio. And I am Jason Warren, the Director of Strategic Engagement. As John noted, I have the unique opportunity to have worked both sides of the state budget process, both as a legislative aide and now as an advocate. I did 8 years on the legislative side, and then I just hit my 10-year mark actually on Sunday as an advocate now. This is the 10th budget that I've had the opportunity to be a part of, certainly not as much as Bill has. But I have had that unique opportunity to work on this from both sides of the process. So if we can go to the next slide. Want to focus my comments today really on one issue, which is the work that Greater Ohio has been doing on brownfield work. But I do want to hit a couple of highlights here as well about the work that we've been doing on the transportation infrastructure as well as legacy cities. So on the transportation and infrastructure, we were very heavily involved in the state transportation budget process. That was actually already passed and enacted at the end of March. And the main thing that Greater Ohio was focused on as part of the transportation budget was trying to make sure that there was no cut in state funding for public transit. 2 years ago, the state enacted a historic transportation budget that invested $70 million in public transit at the state level, the first time that we had seen that amount of money committed to public transit in a very long time. And unfortunately, when the governor's proposed budget was released at the beginning of February, the administration had proposed a 90% cut in public transportation funding. They wanted to take it from 70 down to about $7.5 million. Greater Ohio is among the coalition of groups that came together to urge the legislature to increase that funding, which they did. The transportation budget, as it was signed, restored the funding back up to $70 million. It is not quite the same $70 million that was approved 2 years ago. 2 years ago, that funding was all GRF funding, so it came straight from the state budget and was able to be utilized for a variety of purposes. The budget, as it was enacted this year, includes a combination of both the GRF funding as well as federal highway funding. Federal funding does not have the same restrictions that state gas tax restrictions do. There are some limitations on how that money can be used, but the combination of that state and federal funding was able to get that back up to the $70 million per year. So we're very happy to see that happen. The other infrastructure issue that we have been involved in, and actually which was just signed into law on Monday, was the legislative initiative to begin to invest state resources into broadband expansion. This is an issue that I think that has been particularly brought to the forefront because of the pandemic. We've had so many more people who have been working from home, going to school from home, and that's very difficult to do if you live in an area of the state that does not have broadband access. And so while there were efforts that were underway pre-pandemic to begin to make some of these investments, certainly going into the pandemic, it exacerbated this problem. And so the legislature was finally able to get together and pass legislation that the governor just signed. And 90 days from now, we'll begin to see some of that money flowing to be able to help local communities begin to make their investments in broadband expansion. On legacy cities, Greater Ohio has been working with the Ohio Department of Developmental Services to provide recommendations about the governor's proposed community infrastructure program. This is part of the broader proposal that the governor announced back in February, part of the Investing in Ohio's Future initiative. This would provide $200 million in infrastructure grants to communities across Ohio. These funds could be used for a variety of issues, and Greater Ohio is working with ODSA to ensure that the funds are being appropriated in the most strategic way possible. Greater Ohio is also part of the Rebuilding Ohio Coalition. This is a group of community economic development advocates who are pushing the state to invest ARPA funds into a new community transformation fund that would provide $50 million to CDFIs to do catalytic lending and technological assistance to businesses and neighborhoods, especially hard hit by the pandemic's economic fallout. So if we can go on to the next slide, I want to concentrate my remarks today on the work that Greater Ohio has been doing regarding investment in brownfields. Now, if you are unfamiliar, a brownfield is a former commercial or industrial site that, due to economic or environmental contamination, is unsuitable for redevelopment until we get the opportunity to go in and remediate that site so that new development can occur. Brownfields can range in size from everything as small as a former dry cleaners to as large as an abandoned automobile factory. And the existence of brownfields across the state really inhibits a community's ability to invest in long-term economic development. Ohio was once a national leader in brownfield redevelopment through the Clean Ohio Revitalization Fund. This was a program that was approved actually by voters back in the year 2000. And between 2002 and 2013, the state invested $400 million in brownfield remediation projects. Funding for the Clean Ohio program, or CORF, was eliminated in 2013. And since that time, Greater Ohio has been working to refund that program through a dedicated source of funding that would once again get the state involved in investment in brownfield remediation. What our research found was that the Ohio Revised Code currently allows for the use of what's referred to as deferred payments, commonly referred to as the excess liquor profits, which Jobs Ohio returns to the state each year. The revised code says that funding can either go to the general revenue fund or it can go to the CORF program. Since 2013, that money has gone into the general revenue fund. What Greater Ohio is trying to do is have that money dedicated exclusively for the use of the CORF program. Earlier this year, working with a bipartisan group of legislators in both the Ohio House and the Ohio Senate, we saw bills introduced, House Bill 143 and Senate Bill 84, which would do just that. It would dedicate that deferred payments to the CORF program. And just yesterday, I had the opportunity to testify on behalf of Greater Ohio to the Senate Finance Committee, encouraging the adoption of an amendment which would do the same thing and have that money go towards the CORF program. If we can go to the next slide. As I noted, the CORF program had been a very highly successful program when it operated between 2002 and 2013, investing $400 million in brownfields. Well, that sounds like a lot of money. What happened with the funding is actually rare among state programs, and that it actually produced money for the state. Our research found that the CORF program generated a nearly 5-to-1 return on investment, producing $4.67 for every $1 that the state invested in brownfield remediation. During its peak, CORF contributed $1.4 billion annually to the state's GDP. And still today, CORF sites continue to contribute tax revenues, both through the businesses that are located there and new housing that has been located on those sites. If we can go to the next slide. Greater Ohio's research also found that for every job created or sustained through economic activity directly tied to remediating brownfield sites, one more additional job was indirectly created or sustained, and that $500 million in household and business earnings were generated annually by remediated sites across the state of Ohio. So this is why we see that this is so important for Ohio to begin reinvesting in brownfields. I have a few examples that we have across the state from the previous CORF program that we feel highlight why this was such a successful program and why we should be focusing on this again. So if we can go to the next slide. The first one that I want to highlight is the Top Ray manufacturing site in Springfield. This was formerly a farm equipment factory operated by International Harvester in the city of Springfield. And they received a Clean Ohio grant of $2.2 million and leveraged a further $9.8 million from other public and private sources to redevelop the site. That investment produced a $20.9 million in new economic activity on cleanup alone, along with 750 jobs and $180.5 million in new economic activity on cleanup alone. Since that project was completed, Top Rate Manufacturing has relocated in there and annually supports 555 jobs, $140 million in economic activity, and more than $3.7 million in state local taxes generated each year. Next slide is Tech Town, which is in Dayton. This is a former GM facility. Back in 2003, the city of Dayton received a $6 million CORF grant, and along with $10 million from public and private sources to develop the new business incubator that today houses more than 35 new tech-oriented businesses and provides 500 employment jobs, producing $196.6 million in economic outputs each year, and more than $6 million in state and local taxes each year. And then on the next slide, you have my final example, which is in New Boston, Ohio, located along the Ohio River. The Southern Ohio Port Authority received a $3.3 million CORF grant, and along with $4.2 million in other public and private investment, redeveloped a former steel mill into a retail complex for this rural Appalachian community, creating more than 500 jobs for the area, producing $22.9 million in economic output each year, and generating $3.2 million in state and local taxes each year. So on the next slide, I will conclude my remarks by telling you the same thing that I told the Senate Finance Committee yesterday, that it is imperative that Ohio begin to invest in brownfields now in order for the state to remain economically competitive. A story in Monday's Columbus Dispatch noted that last week, at least 2 deals for businesses to invest and create jobs in Ohio fell through because environmental issues that could have been addressed had we had a program like the Clean Ohio Revitalization Fund in place. Investing in brownfields now is going to help us to create jobs for Ohio's future. So you can see there on the screen how you can get in contact with me if you have any questions about this or any of the other issues Greater Ohio has been involved in. It's also our Twitter handle as well as my own. I routinely post activities that we're up to at the Statehouse and other initiatives that we are working on. And really appreciate the opportunity to be here today, and we'll look forward to the continued dialogue.
Thanks, Jason. We appreciate that, and we appreciate that additional perspective. I do want to stop here and remind you, if folks have questions, they can stick them in the chat. Then we'll come back to those at the end of this discussion. I also want to thank Catherine, who's helping us manage all these presentations and slides and all that. I've decided that is the biggest challenge of Zooms, are sharing slides and getting them to appear on screen. That and not muting yourself. But anyways, now we're going to hear from Amanda. Amanda, what's at the top of your list around this budget, particularly from the Policy Matters Ohio perspective? And I think you might also want to talk about what you think might be on the horizon federally, with the American Jobs Plan and the federal infrastructure bill that Bill mentioned. So I wonder if you could sort of help us cover those issues.
I would love to, and I am going to take folks on a deep dive into transportation. And I think you lawyers out there will appreciate that I prefer to control my own slides. So I'm going to share my screen. Yeah, success. I also had a backup plan that Catherine had access to the PowerPoint in case that didn't work. So I think you lawyers will also appreciate that backup plan. All right, let's get started. You'll see here that I put in quotes the word transportation when I'm referencing the Ohio transportation budget. And that is because there are a lot of powerful interests that see it is the Ohio highway budget. In fact, about 90% of all, or 97% of all resources in the transportation budget go towards roads and highways, and those powerful interests consider that their money. And so only by their graces can we use that money for other things. I will say that as Policy Matters, a founding member of a coalition called Move Ohio, we are statewide and we are very diverse. While we don't have any money to speak of, our power is in our numbers, and there is a lot of very passionate, dedicated people across a wide range of interests that care very much about our transportation system and having better public transit. So from faith, organized labor, anti-poverty, environmental groups, urbanists, etc. Elderly and people with disabilities are a particularly active member of our coalition. So lots of folks. So I am also going to get into the weeds, which I think some of you won't appreciate. For others of you, bear with me. I got some other good stuff in here too. But just by way of background, folks should know that you heard a lot about the general revenue fund so far, but we actually have a separate budget as well for transportation. And it is also runs the sort of same 2-year biennial process. It is made largely of gas taxes, motor vehicle registration and license fees, but also there's a significant portion of federal transportation dollars that come into that budget. It largely funds the Ohio Department of Transportation, but there's also a pretty significant chunk of those funds that go towards public safety, because at the end of the day, driving is dangerous. And so there are accidents and there's need for emergency services. There's also a lot of money that goes to patrolling roads and highways, make sure people, are exercising due diligence when they're behind the wheel of a car. The budget itself moves very quickly. This year it was introduced towards the end of February, and there's a legal or statutory deadline that they finish it up by March 31st. So not much more than a month to go through both the House, the Senate, then create a compromise between the House and Senate, and then go to the desk of the governor. And rarely do they miss that deadline, but it does happen once in a blue moon. All right, here's the weeds part. So I talked about how funding is made up of gas tax, license fees, and federal funds. And the general dogma, the legal dogma out there is that those gas tax revenues cannot be used for anything but highways. And there's some truth to that, but it's not the whole truth and nothing but the truth. And so let's get a little into that, because I really love for you lawyers out there to put your hats on. So what the language says is that the gas tax provisions, and this also applies to motor vehicle and license fees, anything that comes that is any way related to moving motor vehicles falls under this umbrella. So inside of that language, there's a phrase called other statutory highway purposes. And this is often used to justify, for instance, congestion mitigation. That's a big one. And I think most of you can just imagine different ways we can reduce congestion. And one of them is to get some of those cars and trucks off the road. So that right there could be put into a statute to define congestion mitigation as, you know, things like public transit, promoting biking and walking, promoting freight rail upgrades, for instance. All of those things move vehicles from the road. Another sort of big highway purpose, highway preservations. Well, the fewer cars and trucks you have on the road, the longer that those roads are preserved. Highway safety, we already talked a little bit, and I'll get more into about how dangerous it is to drive. Then you add drunk driving and distracted driving. So another reason to invest in alternative opportunities. And then of course, air quality improvements. You could easily have an environmental fee or a portion of the gas tax set aside to improve air quality. Us economists refer to that as internalizing the external costs of, in this case, driving. All right, so the other, so one last thing for you lawyers out there. I'm dying for somebody to write a legal memo on this. I tried to get the Ohio Attorney General to do that once when it was Richard Cordray. He declined. But this is like, people take this as fact that you cannot use the gas tax for anything other than highways. And that is just not true, and I need the ammunitions from you lawyers, so call me if you want to do that. So federal flexible funds, let's talk a little bit about that. That makes up the other sort of half of the Department of Transportation budget. Also huge amount of money, and this table breaks down how the money can be used. The second biggest pot is the surface transportation dollars. And you can see here, they can be used for roads and bridges, transit, bikeways, pedestrian infrastructure, electric vehicles, all kinds of stuff. But we don't do that in Ohio. We do not flex those funds away from roads and highways. Or we're working on it. We made a teensy-weensy bit of progress in that vein, but it's been an uphill battle. By and large, we do not take advantage of the different things that these funds can be used for that are laid out in this table. Also interesting, you'll see at the top, the biggest pot is the National Highway Performance Program. It can also be used for bike and pedestrian, but the most interesting about the flexibility of federal funds, you could actually take up to half of each pot and put it in another pot. So you could take half of these highway dollars and put it in the surface transportation dollars if you wanted to. But no one in power in Ohio wants to do that. All right, so that takes us to where we are with the transportation system. We've essentially underinvested in public transportation for nearly a century. And I would say that's true both as a state and as a nation, but we've done a particularly bad job in Ohio. We rank at the bottom of the pack, and I say this is despite the fact we're the 7th most populated state. Frankly, we should be at least 7th. In the amount we invest in public transit, but we are not. And that has implications, which we will get into. We have one of the biggest transportation budgets in the country, but like I said, it all goes towards roads and highways. And at the end of the day, that creates a system that basically makes it nearly impossible to get by without a car. So that's one little last weed thing on public transit, is that it's historically was funded out of that general revenue fund, where it competed against Health and Human Services, like Medicaid. It also competed against education and economic development, K through 12. It's, and it wasn't winning that battle. When we first started engaging in this work a little over a decade ago, transit was funded at about $7 million. Compare that to billions of dollars we spend on roads and highways. And imagine that $7 million was being spread around to 63 different transit systems. Now, also compare that to what we spend on school busing, which is closer to $750 million. So we've got this massive school bus system, which I call public transportation, but just for kids and used twice a day to get them to and from school. And so we spend nearly $1 billion on that, but we put 70 million in the public transit system that serves everybody else all other times to get everywhere else they need to go. So when we first started this work, we said we need to take it out of the general revenue fund. Its transportation is not just a health and human service, it's a transportation alternative, and it needs to be at the big boy table when we're talking about how we build our transportation system. So over time, we have definitely improved. If you go out even before the graph, we started, under here at less than 10 million. And slowly over time, we increased, then we hit a wall, went back down, and increased over time. And then ultimately, this is where we are now, which is where we got in the last budget. The orange here, as Jason described earlier, is federal flex funds, and the blue is general revenue fund dollars. So we went from all general revenue fund dollars to getting more of those federal flex funds. And in the last budget, though, they pushed the transportation budget out of the federal flex dollars because they wanted to use more money for highways and put it into the general revenue fund, but they kept the line item in the transportation budget. So we were in this really weird place. And then this last budget, we ended up somewhere close to the middle, half funded out of the general revenue fund and half funded by federal flex funds. So we have made progress. We went from 7 million to 70 million. So that's a solid improvement. And I can remember when we first started talking to legislators, even the most progressive ones, that we should be funding public transit much bigger numbers. And at that time, we pushed for 75 million. This was maybe 10 years ago. Even the progressive legislators thought we were insane. That's crazy. We funded at 7 million. But here we are now, right around that number. But let's put it in context. Again, we spend billions of dollars on roads and highways, and that 70 million amounts to less than 2% of the budget. Historically, we've put less than 1% towards public transit, so we are now at 2%. That's definitely an improvement, but nowhere near where we need to be. And this little pie chart I made for you, Chip, I have to admit Bill's pie chart is definitely better than my pie chart, but this little sliver here is what we spend on public transit. This big orange thing is what we spend on everything else. 97% of that is actually roads and highways, but we do put a little bit of money into airports and waterways. So why does it matter? Transportation is how we connect. It's how we get where we need to go. And it's how we get to education and training opportunities. It's how we get to jobs. It's how we get to the doctor's office or the grocery store. Because we built this car-centric transportation system, it's important to understand that cars are expensive. They are expensive to own. They are expensive to operate. They are expensive to insure, and they are expensive to maintain. And they can be prohibitively expensive for low-income families, and particularly low-wage workers. For elderly and people with disabilities, driving may not be an option at all. So we've created transportation barriers to get to education and opportunity, get to jobs, to get to the doctor's office, get to the grocery store. We've got a disconnect between where we live and where we need to go. And this is not just an urban issue. A lot of people think it is. This is true in rural areas as well, especially with the population in rural areas aging. But rural areas in Ohio have also been hit hard by the opioid epidemic, and many folks are no longer legally able to drive. And they need to get to treatment centers and all kinds of other things. But many of those other things or treatment centers are not nearby. So our transportation system has a disparate impact. Roughly 8% of Ohio households have no access to a car at all. Others may have access, but it may be unreliable in lots of different ways. Poor people tend to drive cars that are more likely to break down, or they have to rely on people that may be not reliable. And that's a difficult situation for people. Other disparate impacts, low-income Ohioans, particularly Black Ohioans, are more likely to live near polluting, heavily trafficked roads with pollution, and that contributes to things like asthma. And because we drive everywhere, and it's frankly dangerous to walk, it's dangerous to bike, that we have an obesity epidemic, and our transportation patterns play a really big and important role in that. And of course, it affects bicyclists in particular. Pedestrians and bicyclists often get hit by cars too often, particularly true for low-income folks because they walk and bike more because they can't afford a car. And this little graph talks about sort of the intersection of transportation and health. We already talked about accidents, so emergency services, obesity and passive transportation versus active, and air pollution's connected to asthma, and of course, access to opportunity, to jobs and income stability and housing stability, and all of those things we've already talked to has significant implications for health. So that's sort of the gist of why it matters. The transportation budget's actually wrapped up. So we have landed where we are, and that will be true for the next 2 years. But in the meantime, there are in fact other opportunities. Many of you might know that Medicaid is in the process of reforming itself. And I think over the next couple of years, there's going to be huge opportunities to weigh in on that. And I think an important piece of that equation is there's a lot of funding that it goes for transportation associated with public services, and they all come down in silos for different things. And I think one of the important things with respect to Medicaid reform is thinking about public transportation or transportation to health services and other services differently, thinking about pooling those funds together. And then this is something Kasich administration, is something you probably know, has thought about in the past, but what they wanted to do is privatize the whole thing. What I think we need to do is create regions, and that's what this map is over here. Create regions, but connect our different public transit systems in those regions and pool those funds to go to beefing up and supporting our existing transit systems. I met one rural transit system operator that said they had bake sales in order to raise funds for their transit system. Just absolutely unacceptable to me. I find it incredibly flooring. And then, of course, we already touched on the American Rescue Plan. There was some direct funding for transit in that, which is important to sort of shore up the transit systems that were also, as many of you probably know, hit hard by the pandemic with loss of fare revenues, but also the need to actually increase services so that they can space people out. They lost sort of some of their local revenue support as well. So that's an important piece. There's a big pot of flexible funds. We also have heard about, we might want to think about whether some of those should be used for transportation, maybe to start this reform process, for instance. One of my big focuses, though, right now is the American Jobs Plan, the next big federal debate. And it's really an opportunity to reimagine transportation and make it the kind of system that it needs to be. Thinking about, just what should be the highway transit breakdown. Should it be more like 50-50 maybe? Possibly. Let's talk about that. Also, there's limitations on federal dollars right now that only allows them, by and large, with some exceptions, to go to capital expenditures, and we want to see these be able to go towards operating on, fund bus drivers who run the buses, for instance, or the dispatchers. So those are the big opportunities going forward, and I will leave you, particularly you lawyers, with a question I want you to ponder. We talked about how important transportation is to get to all the things you need to. And is transportation a civil right? Because if it is, not only should we do better, but we must. And that is my spiel.
Thanks, Amanda. So I have one question I wanted to sort of pose for everybody. It's a simple question, I think, but I'll be interested to hear how you all approach it. And the question is, you've all, you've done advocacy, you've worked around the budget, around the Statehouse. What's the one piece of advice you have for people on being effective, in today's Statehouse, around budget or around anything? So maybe Bill, I'll start with you since you're our senior leader here and our distinguished guest. So,
Well, I'm certainly senior. We're trying to sort out this Medicare situation, if anybody has any information for me. Anyway, I don't know. This is a fairly liberal crowd, I'll venture to say. I just think we should not judge people too harshly when we're approaching people in the legislature. People don't necessarily think like us. I mean, I'll give you that. I'm not sure where they picked up on their thinking, but I will say that it's good to not assume too much. And I have found friends on the Republican side of the aisle that I never expected to be friends. And they may be terrible on other issues, but they have some connection to something we're working on. So I wouldn't write them off. For one thing, if you haven't noticed, we're kind of a red state. So if you're not willing to approach Republicans with an open mind, at least to an extent, I'm not asking you to ignore reality, but I think to an extent you can, you may well find people that will help you. Maybe not on everything you want, maybe not as much as you want, but you know, when I look at the Senate leadership, we don't really see eye to eye with the Senate president very much, but you know, Senator Hottinger, who's right up there in leadership, Senator Dolan is an approachable guy. I mean, he doesn't always do what we want or everything we want. So I just, you know, say it's a good practice to just not make too many assumptions and give people a chance. Gina Wilt, who works with me now, has been great because she worked in the Republican caucus. She worked for Senator Olslager, the budget guy who's been the finance chairman, I think, since around the early 1900s. But she learned a lot by working with him, and she's great at navigating the hallways and byways around the Statehouse. She knows people's families, and so that I just say that she's helped me be even more open-minded, at least at times. So I just say that's some good advice I would leave you with.
Thanks, Bill. Jason, what about you?
Yeah, no, I think that's very, that's everything that Bill said is very accurate. You know, what I would add with it, because it is interesting, you often find allies that you did not at all expect to have on these issues. Some of these legislators will fool you based on a lot of the things that they will say publicly, and then you have a private conversation with them and you're rather surprised at the openness that they'll have and the willingness that they have to work with you on any particular issue. The other thing is that I think oftentimes, you know, all of us as advocates, you know, we somewhat have a tendency to, you know, think that, you know, we've thought all of this through and, you know, our policy is the best policy, but you do have to have a willingness to be able to compromise. You know, that's something in particular that we've been working on with this brownfield funding. You know, we've done all of our research and we found all of this stuff, and I have all of these numbers that show just how great that this program is and the tremendous benefits that it's going to bring for the state. But I cannot be so pig-headed as to not acknowledge the fact that the source of money that we have right now is a pretty big pot of money. And, you know, right now it's sitting at about $71 million, and the state is not going to be necessarily willing to put all of that money towards that one program. So, you know, we're having to compromise right now and work with the legislature to, you know, come up with what we all agree is a reasonable amount of money that we can kick towards this program, at least in the initial phases, because I know that once we're able to demonstrate to the legislature that all of these past numbers that we had are going to be there again, there'll be a little bit more willingness for them to put more money towards that program. So, you know, just approach them knowing that you have a good idea, but be willing to compromise with them, because they are politicians and there's only so far at times that they're going to be willing to go.
Thanks, Jason. Brian, what's your view of this?
We have a theory of change on this, where we believe we have to address the myths and the misconceptions, and we do that head on. We say if you want to change a narrative, you have to change the narrators. So our theory of organizing is to place those folks who are most impacted in the center of the action. And that's in the center of our organizing, in the center of our power structure in terms of how we work as a movement, and you know, highlighting those stories, putting them right up in front of the legislature and right before the public. You know, Reverend Barber our national co-chair says sometimes you have to break the nation's heart, you know, in order to be able to build it back up to heal it compassionately. So yeah, we're not real original there, but we want to put the people who are most in the center of this, who have the most to lose up front, because most of the time the legislators don't interact with those folks. They're used to dealing with lobbyists and lawyers and people of power, and a certain measure of constituents that may take the time to call them or to pursue them. But on the really, really big issues, to have 50 or 60 folks in your constituency dedicated calling on something, and along with 30 of your colleagues, that doesn't happen as much as it used to, unless you're watching a lot of Mr. Smith Goes to Washington type stuff, I guess. I don't know, but that's where we come in, actually.
Thanks, Brian. That's really important. Amanda, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's value in both approaches. I see it as sort of an inside approach and an outside approach. And I think it's important. And a lot of the work I think we do is you could define as the outside approach, right? You're pushing the conversation to a much more progressive place, but in the meantime, you got to take the baby steps to get there. That's the inside approach. But if all we ever do is compromise, we'll only ever land where we, pretty close to where we are. So you have to push the envelope as well, change the conversation.
I think, Bill, your comment about not assuming too much, I think is right on target. I just think back to, when Governor Kasich took office. If someone had told me that he was going to be the person responsible for expanding Medicaid in the state of Ohio, I don't know that I would have believed it. And so, and I go through that experience, I think, with every new governor and every new General Assembly, where I'm sort of surprised. And I think, Brian, your point of really putting the people who are impacted, by these decisions, sort of at the center of the conversation, I also think is really important. I have sat through enough budget hearings over the years and have witnessed where those stories actually move legislators and change decisions and change the trajectory of the debate. So I think that's right. And I think, more of that is probably, a good idea. And the way I always think about it too is that I always is trying to find that balance between the pragmatic and the prophetic. The pragmatic, like, okay, what can I get done right now? Yeah, how much can I get? But then also, that sort of speaking truth to power and just sort of challenging people and saying, this is wrong or this is right, and being willing to do that. So it's hard, I think, to sort of find that balance sometimes. I know we had a couple of questions in the chat. Yeah, go ahead, Amanda.
Yeah, I just want to add, I honestly, I always think of this, but the most powerful thing that I ever did was take a person with disability down with me to Columbus to testify, and we tag teamed, and she started. And I could literally see the folks on the transportation committee, their hearts melt. But you can't stop there, because it can't just be about, in this case, Donna. You have to also say Donna's not alone. This is a systemic problem that affects many people. Because otherwise folks just want to give Donna $50 and move on with their lives. And that's not going to solve the problem.
Yeah. Thank you, Amanda. I just wanted to say that, Dr. King says, we want to force folks who are desirous to tell us no to have to say yes. And that begins that process, your friend Donna, and letting everybody know Donna's not alone. Donna is us. We are Donna. And Mr. or Ms. Legislator, everybody's watching your reaction and what you're going to do, because you are also Donna and representing of Donna and the rest of us. So.
Yeah, that's a good point. Now, I know there are a couple of questions in the chat, and Bill, I think you answered them. I don't know if we have any other questions from folks. One was around landlords, sort of trying to game the system to try and get around the eviction moratorium. Are you seeing a lot of that, Bill, in the state? Are you hearing a lot of stories like that?
Yeah, well, the moratorium, the national one through the CDC has been problematic kind of from the beginning. One, you had to sign up. You had to fill out a certification to demonstrate that you met the eligibility criteria, which in some courts, I think Cleveland did a pretty good job overall, but based on stories I've heard from elsewhere. But, those statements would then start to be challenged by landlords, the landlords' lawyers. There's a fairly low life form there, landlord lawyers. But in any case, they challenged these individual tenants and said, "You're not, we don't think you've applied for every possible type of assistance you could apply for." And they'd get the judges to throw these cases out so the person could then be evicted. So they figured out ways around the moratorium. The moratorium did not have very good enforcement mechanisms. So and there was nobody to really go complain to when you saw landlords gaming the system. So then they challenged the whole constitutionality of the moratorium in multiple different courts. So it's really on life support whether there'll be any moratorium going forward. And that is important. And, we have all this rental assistance money available. In some ways, landlords are shooting themselves in the foot by trying to, rapidly proceed to eviction, because if they would help the tenant apply for assistance, then they could get their arrearages covered. Then they could get their rent going forward covered. It would be a win-win instead of a lose-lose. So the moratorium's been very difficult to work with. And some states and local governments had their own moratoriums, which I think worked better. But the federal one through the CDC was a nice idea, but it's been difficult.
Right. I know the other issue Phil mentioned here was this notion, which I've heard some about, the sort of shallow subsidy program, sort of bridging the gap between sort of the market rent and what that person could afford. Are any communities sort of pursuing that at all, Bill? Or?
Well, under the regular home program, very few places use tenant-paid rental assistance with home money. They relied on the regular Section 8 housing choice voucher program through the housing authorities to the extent which they had any. But this program, you got to remember, this is for homeless people. So this is not just regular old home money. This money is going to be specifically targeted to homeless people. And I think based on conversations with the HUD secretary and also some of the senior leadership at HUD that have come in post-Trump, they are intending for this money to be targeted at housing. It could be used for other things, even shelter, but they want to emphasize housing, and tenant-based rental assistance is one way to do that that's pretty flexible, that we like. The other one is housing development projects, but those take longer. So either way, I think they're both good strategies. We just got to keep in mind, it's really not for home ownership. It's not for just anybody. It's really targeted to people that are homeless.
Thanks, Bill. That's important. And you remind us that we have at least our very own from Cleveland, former Congresswoman Marcia Fudge is now our HUD Secretary Fudge. So that's a good thing on many levels. So Chip, I think we've answered the questions that people pose. I'm going to turn it back over to you to help us wrap this program up. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, John. And if there was ever an opportunity teaching, this is what I would give my class. This is a classic discussion of state politics, how to work it, how to make it happen. I just remember one night I was in Columbus, middle 80s, and Barbara Anderson had been firebombed in Slavic Village multiple times. And I brought her down as a witness to talk about the Ohio Civil Rights Commission budget, which you know, was something like the transportation budget for, you know, was, you could find it on the back of a stamp. It didn't exist. And she gave this wonderful moving testimony, and this was, they would have dinner and they would go back. And when they went back, they tended to fall asleep. And I remember one of the people in the back row kind of woke up and said, "Oh, this really happened to you?" Was like, you know, he woke up to civil rights, and we did get some money in that budget. We got $400,000 that got put in the budget. But boy, prophetic and bearing witness and all that. And I just had one final question for all you guys. How do you keep the wheels going on these things? I mean, this is not, I've never seen foundations jump up and down and say, "Boy, let's fund advocacy. That's a great idea. Let's get down to Columbus and do that." How do you guys, how have you been able to keep the wheels going on advocacy for state public policy? And that'll be it for me.
I'll say 2 words: Marcia Egbert.
Okay.
Marcia has been phenomenal, and not just her, but the whole Gun Foundation crowd, because they see the connection. They're very Cleveland, Cuyahoga County focused, but they know that if they don't fund advocacy on a whole range of issues, that Cleveland's not going to get the resources that it needs, or Cuyahoga County. And they've been doing it for years. And I think the best, I mean, they're not the only ones. There are other good Cleveland foundations, like the Sisters of Charity Foundation they're very interested in some of the housing issues. They've been good partners, and you know, you just work at it long enough, you find the people that have the vision to see the importance of advocacy. And I actually think the more things you get done, the more resources you attract. And it's because, you know, if you start being able to win even small things, people will go, "Hey, those folks are doing some good work." And I think that could be true for the outside game. I think the outside game is very critical, but also just for the regular Statehouse kind of advocacy work. So that would be my thoughts about it.
Anybody else?
Yeah, no, Bill is exactly right. I mean, I think that, you know, when you get into, I think when all of us probably first started about this, we're always the wide-eyed, we think we're getting in this and we're going to somehow be able to change the world. And we very quickly realize that, you know, we're spending more of our time raging against the machine than anything else. You do have to be able, though, to accept the fact that those very small changes that you're able to accomplish or able to demonstrate that, you know, your work is accomplishing something, and when you can consistently show that year after year after year, you're able to build confidence in your funders, and they recognize that, and you're eventually able to establish those bigger things.
Anybody else? Amanda, any thoughts?
Yeah, well, I think the most important thing is that it's a marathon. You know, pace yourself, because, you know, change doesn't not happen overnight. But transportation, I have just never been able to get that work funded. So, you know, I rely heavily on the passion of my bosses and the passion of other folks we work with. It's definitely something that a lot of folks are dedicated to working on, because one, because it's so important, but two, because Ohio does such a terrible job at it.
Okay, well, thank you all. Appreciate it. We're probably going to have one more forum coming up here in early June, looking at an issue of, we had done just before the pandemic, a thing on PACE, which was a funding formula to help people fix up their homes and then put them in debt. And now there's a new program that's doing the same thing all over again. So we want to take a quick look at that. Thank you all. Thank all of our speakers. John Corlett, thank you. And Catherine, as always. Let me just say something about Catherine. Catherine has been with us for about 1.5 years. She has been our VISTA Volunteer in Service to America, which is the equivalent of the Peace Corps. And you literally receive Peace Corps wages, I mean, poverty wages, for doing this kind of work. And she's off to the University of California, Berkeley Law School next year. And we will miss her. And we're still looking for another Vista. So if somebody knows somebody would like to be a Vista, we'll help them with their housing. We'd like to have them be with us and work with us. So that's it, folks. Take a great day, enjoy yourselves, and enjoy the warm sun outside. Bye-bye.